Joining me now is Jocelyn Benson, Michigan's Secretary of State, who signed an amicus brief opposing North Carolina Republicans in this case. So you also observed the arguments today. I saw you nodding along to some of Julia's reporting. I mean, what was your take, particularly on those swing three, if they are them, Kavanaugh, Barrett, and maybe Justice Roberts, too?
I think they very much were showing themselves to be listening and open to all the different decisions and maybe looking for a narrow path where they could, reject the Supreme Court's work in North Carolina or decision, but still not completely reject or upend decades, centuries of checks and balances in every state that enable us to run fair elections through the balance of power that has been long established and has worked for many years.
Roberts is sort of famous for wanting to find a middle path on these kinds of things, the narrowest possible ruling. Is there a Goldilocks option for the court here if they want to back up North Carolina but not totally gut the way we run elections in this country?
That was really what a lot of the discussion I observed was. And it was very, very long oral arguments, but it was one in which justices were trying to find a middle ground or find some way to not completely remove the important checks that not just a state Supreme Court, but a state election official and executive officer has to bear on ensuring democracy works for everyone. And also recognizing the power of a state constitution and how the independent state legislature doctrine really could eliminate or completely abrogate the state constitution's power to, through interpretation by the court, really check a otherwise unbridled authority of a political actor like the state legislature.
And Alito and the proponents of this theory argue, I mean, you take North Carolina, where this is based, is a pretty close to a 50-50 state. I mean, it's always a very competitive state. The original Republican map, there would have been something like 10 Republicans, 4 Democrats. Are Alito and company basically saying, like, yeah, if you could draw that map, go nuts, that's fair? It's
a question of who should draw the maps. I mean, in Michigan, we have an independent commission, a citizens commission that was put into our state constitution and could potentially be upended by this case if it goes very broadly. And it's quite ironic because we've seen the best way to get to fair maps is to put citizens in charge of our districts. That's what we've seen in Michigan and California and other states. And so to really endorse not just this theory that has no grounding really in the Constitution, giving state legislatures unbridled, unchecked authority over redistricting, would also open the door for intense gerrymandering by really some of the most political actors in our states.
I want to play for you some of what North Carolina's Democratic governor said about this case today and get your reaction on the other side. Here's Roy Cooper on MSNBC earlier today.
You know, taking it to the place where I think many of them would want to go, and if you look at Donald Trump's plan, being able to ignore the popular vote in a state and change presidential electors. Depending on what the U.S. Supreme Court does here, it could give state legislatures unfettered authority to set the rules for federal elections, and it could affect the presidential election. And not just with electors, but with the rules of how you operate the voting, restricting the vote for certain populations.
So obviously that's a pretty dire warning, and this goes far beyond drawing congressional maps. Is that warning overblown?
Well, I think the interesting thing I saw about the oral arguments today was the suggestion that even if this case gets decided on narrower grounds that just focus on redistricting, it could open the door for a future case next term or a subsequent term that does take this further and does approach some of the more dire consequences that the governor was talking about and that Justice Kagan talked about and raised with the petitioners and respondents today. So, whatever direction, whether it's a broad or narrow determination that the court makes in this case, we could very easily go down a road of giving these political actors too much authority when it needs to be a balance, checks and balances in our states.
And we were talking about this before we came on the air with Michigan's independent commission here. If the court rules against, the Democratic argument here, does the Michigan system just get thrown out and go back to zero? It's hard for me to imagine how it's a small c conservative argument to say, we appreciate what you've done in Michigan in setting up your own system, but actually we're going to tell you can't even do that.
Yeah, because it came from citizens amending the state constitution to create an independent citizen redistricting commission. And so if the Supreme Court were to go as far as to completely say that the state's constitution has nothing to say that could curb the state legislature's authority around elections, then it does call into question citizen-led amendments to state constitutions like ours that actually did create independent redistricting that's citizen-led for and nonpartisan for the lawmakers in our state. So it's dire consequences indeed. My hope and my read on the case today is that it may not go that far, but it could very easily be an opinion that opens the door for future very dire opinions in subsequent terms.
I appreciate anyone who can read oral arguments and tell me which way the wind is going to blow.
I used to be the dean of a
so.
law school. So.
Well, there you go. Far more qualified than I. All right, Jocelyn Benson, Secretary of State for Michigan, thank you very much for making the time today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.